We all know that sugary foods or ultra processed foods are highly addictive, and most of all, that they're not really the best for us in terms of health and wellness. Yet some of us still struggle with the pull to eat these foods. And a lot of times it is not just because we are not strong enough or good enough or have enough willpower. Sometimes it could be something beyond the food itself that is causing us to turn to these foods. In this conversation, we talk a lot about how we can identify food addiction, what certain food additives can make us more addicted, and then what we can do to start supporting ourselves to be free from these addictions. Hey guys, my name is Judy Cho, and I am a board certified holistic nutritionist. And I have a private functional medicine practice where we have served over 2,000 carnivore clients and patients get closer to root cause healing. And we often start with the Carnivore Cures all meat elimination diet. Today, I have the pleasure of sitting down with Dr. Jen Unwin. She is a renowned clinical psychologist that focuses on food addiction and helps people to free themselves from food addiction. I hate the word addiction because it just has a negative spin to it, but it's really this pull that we are not able to say no to foods that we know are bad for us. It's like when a person that smokes knows that smoking is not good for them, yet still has to go out and have a cigarette, or the e-cigs lately. When certain foods are not good for us, but we're just like, okay, just one more bite, or just one more time, or just the one last time. These thoughts are oftentimes because there is a adverse pull to us and that food. And sometimes it is an addiction, and it's because our dopamine receptors are getting impacted by these foods. And so we have this craving for it. It can also be gut related, where our gut bugs are craving those foods for survival. The food companies also use chemists to make sure that foods are the most attractive, most tasty, and most addictive, and will hit our reward center so that we come back for more. There are so many books and talks that I've had in our podcast that talk about these things, and I'll put it in the show notes. In this conversation, we get tactical of like, so what do we do about it? What do we do if we struggle with food? We use food as a coping mechanism, and we use food and eat foods that we know we don't want to, but we keep going back to it. And then it affects our mental health and our overall health. In this conversation, we talk about tactics. We talk about what additives in foods are the most addictive. And then we talk about how and what percentage of people can heal from food addiction if you follow some of these steps. Let's get right into the interview. Hi, Dr. Jen. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really excited for our community to learn more about the work that you do, the incredible work. So for the people that may not know your work, if you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, for sure. So my name's Dr. Jen Unwin. I'm a clinical psychologist from the UK. I worked in the National Health Service over here for many decades. And then more recently, in the last few years, I've been really concentrating my efforts on understanding food addiction, what the best way to treat it is, but also campaigning to get the condition officially recognized internationally so that there can be more money for research and treatments, really. So yeah, so just anything to do with food addiction now is what I'm super interested in.
And that makes a lot of sense. So let's define what food addiction is. What got you interested in it? Why is it not really recognized as well?
Yeah. Yes, why? Great question. Because it seems so obvious. And if you ask the general public, or I'm sure lots of people listening, can certain foods be addictive? Can you have an addictive relationship with certain foods? Everybody says yes. Everybody recognizes that, at some level, either in themselves, or they know people who are continuing to eat foods that are harming their health, and that makes no sense. So when completely sensible people like you and I are continuing to do something that harms our health, well, maybe the thing to think about is addiction. So it's a complete mystery to me why it isn't recognized, other than obviously there are lots of vested interests in the food industry, because the main culprit here is ultra processed foods, the kind of foods we buy in packages, the kind of foods that are advertised to us day and night, the kind of foods that are presented to us, you know, even when we're just trying to buy petrol, as we would say here, or gas, as you guys would say, you know, you're just trying to go about your daily business, and these foods are everywhere. So there's a lot of money to be made in that addiction model of foods and the kinds of ingredients that are put into ultra processed foods, which make them highly palatable, very Moorish, kind of irresistible. And we do know for sure that certain ingredients in ultra processed foods like sugar, caffeine, and so on, you know, and other ingredients can really hijack the brain, hijack the reward centers of the brain, so that we no longer can rely on willpower not to eat those foods. We're kind of kind of hijacked, really, so that people may have had this experience where you kind of think to yourself, right, I'm you know, I know that particular food is bad for me, whatever it is that's your, in quotes, drug food, maybe ice cream or chocolate or chips or whatever it is. You say to yourself, oh, I'm never eating those again. And then you have a hard day at work, and, you know, you start thinking about how much better you'd feel if you ate this thing. And then you remember that there's some in the cupboard or in the freezer, and you know, slowly that ability to resist it is eroded, and you end up, you know, in a cycle of eating those foods again and then craving them again. So yeah, it can be incredibly difficult for people to resist. So yeah, there's lots of reasons why it happened. I mean, I can maybe it would help people if I described the symptoms of food addiction, and then they can see if they recognize that in themselves or other people. As we say, you know, food addiction isn't a recognized condition. So it's, you know, you can't go in a book and say, you know, this is the diagnosis for food addiction. But what we can do is see what are the symptoms of any other addiction. So alcohol, drugs, nicotine, caffeine. How do we recognize that addiction in people? Okay, so there are, according to the World Health Organization, six symptoms of, they call it substance use disorders, so substance problems. And so in this case, of course, in our minds, we have that the substance is certain foods, ultra processed types of foods, the kind of drug foods that we tend to find it very, very difficult to resist. So myself and my colleague that I work with very closely, Heidi Yever, who's a nutritional therapist, have come up with an acronym, CRAVED, and we've actually got a screening questionnaire, CRAVED, which takes people through the 6 criteria for substance use problems. And C is for cravings and compulsion. So obviously the first symptom of any addiction is that the person is thinking about it, is wanting it, is craving it, and has these sort of compulsions. And what we mean by that is an urge which is very difficult to resist or impossible to resist, and then they go and consume the substance. So C is for cravings and compulsions. And you can, you know, maybe if you're listening, keep a score for yourself of how many of these you think apply to you with certain foods. So I definitely had that in the past with no, for me it was kind of sweet things, so cakes and desserts and biscuits and those chocolate, that kind of stuff. So I would definitely have cravings that I couldn't control. R stands for reaching for more, and this gets to the idea of tolerance. So we all know, for example, with alcohol, that if we had a drink every night, maybe a glass of wine every night, eventually we don't get such an effect. We don't get the intoxicating effect from the one glass, because our bodies and brains have adjusted to that, and we want more. So we might feel like having 2 glasses with dinner instead of 1 glass. So it's this idea of tolerance, where you find yourself consuming more and more to get the same effect. So that's the same with any addiction, like cigarettes or whatever. We tend, you know, you might start with just 1 or 2. Obviously, that's how everybody starts, with 1 or 2, and then the amount builds up. So that's R is reaching for more. A is activities neglected, and this again you see in all addictive problems, where the person starts focusing more and more of their life and their thoughts and their kind of behavior around that substance. And because they're doing that, they start neglecting other things like family, friends, socializing, even work, hobbies, exercise. All of those other things tend to get neglected because you start to think all the time about food, in this case, or whatever the substance is, and having it, trying not to have it, when can you get it next? Maybe feeling bad because you've had too much of it, that kind of thing. So A is activities neglected. V, CRAV, V is for volume. And this is always losing control of the amount of the substance that you consume. So maybe saying to yourself, in this case, because we're talking about food, people will recognize this, I'm sure, saying, right, I'm going to open that packet of biscuits and I'm going to have 2 biscuits. But never being able to keep to the 2 biscuits. This is such a common thing, almost kind of turning around and you've eaten the whole packet. Or, you might even halfway through put them back in the cupboard and try and go and do something else, but you still remember that they're there and you get pulled back to eat the rest of the cookies, we should say, shouldn't we? So that's V. E stands for exclusion, and this is getting at the idea of withdrawal symptoms, so that if you try and stop having those, in this case food, in other cases obviously alcohol, nicotine, whatever it is, you're going to experience some withdrawal symptoms that might be physical or psychological. So in our patients we tend to see things like mood disturbances, feeling kind of grumpy, depressed, maybe anxious, sleep problems, maybe gastrointestinal problems, maybe, it could be a range of symptoms, shakiness. So when people try and quit the ultra processed foods or the, simple carbohydrates, they tend to get withdrawal symptoms. I mean, people talk about that, don't they? Keto flu really is essentially withdrawal symptoms from carbohydrates. And then D is the last one. And this is really a really defining kind of characteristic of addiction, really, is that the one we were mentioning before. D is continued use despite damage. So despite knowing that eating those foods is doing you harm mentally and or physically, you carry on eating them. You really try and stop, and you can't stop. So obviously if somebody has maybe type 2 diabetes, or they know that eating those kinds of foods makes their mental health problems worse, or they've maybe got some other health condition which is being worsened by eating these foods, and yet they can't stop eating them. Or maybe the family said to them, that eating like this is actually doing you harm, but they still can't. So those are the 6. Cravings, needing more and more over time, neglecting other activities, always losing control of the amount, getting withdrawal symptoms, and continued use despite knowing it's doing you harm. And according to the WHO, if you have 3 or more of those symptoms, you have a possible, I mean, it's not a diagnosis, but you have a possible addictive relationship with whatever substance it is we're talking about. So it might be alcohol or drugs, but in our case, we're talking about certain foods. And I'm sure, Judy, you, and I'm sure everybody listening, recognizes that pattern either in themselves or in someone that they know. And we know that the prevalence of people with this this addictive type relationship to certain foods, not all foods obviously, but certain foods, is between maybe 12 and 20% of adults. So we all know somebody. It's a big problem, and is getting more common because, of course, back in the day, in living memory, there weren't all these ultra processed foods hijacking our brains. So it's getting worse and worse over time, and we should be really concerned for the younger generation, who a lot of younger people and adolescents are already exhibiting these symptoms and have very high sugar and high ultra processed food diets. So yeah, so that's how you would recognize it in yourself or in somebody else.
I think that's really helpful. Thank you for framing it in that craved. I struggled with an eating disorder for a long time,
Yeah,
and I fall into so much of that, and I recognize it. The one nuance I'd say about the activities for me specifically would be sometimes it's not that I don't want to do an activity because I'm so obsessed or thinking about the food, but it might be because I went on a binge or I overate or something happened with my food and now I am having self-esteem issues. Like that would then make me
feeling
not want to
bad.
do that activities. So I'm totally right there with you. And I loved it. And I think that brings a lot of really direct questions that you can ask yourself and saying, do you think you struggle with some of these questions or factors? And if you do, it can actually be a food addiction. When I was struggling with my eating disorder, I did a lot of the research in trying to figure out like why is this not defined as an illness in the DSM-5, which is the psychology manual. All of the drug addictions, they're all in one area, but then the food addiction is considered something so separate. It is not considered a diagnosis unless it's an eating disorder, which is something so completely different.
And
But
so different, although there really can be overlap. So what we think now is that,
agreed, agreed.
yes, someone can have food addiction,
Yes,
someone can have an eating disorder, and someone could have both, or someone
yes,
could
no,
have
totally.
neither. Yeah, so we definitely need another diagnosis. It doesn't fit, like you say, it doesn't completely, it's not accounted for by the current diagnoses
Agreed.
for eating disorders. It needs its separate category, but we need to get together with the eating disorders folks and not be kind of, territorial about it, because a lot of patients have features of both. And I think it is, it goes both ways. I think that practitioners who work in the food addiction field need to understand about eating disorder, because you don't want to do the wrong thing by somebody, but also practitioners in the eating disorders world need to acknowledge food addiction, which they on the whole don't really. That's quite,
Yeah.
there's one or two people that are trying to work across, like David Wiss, but in eating disorders terms, once we start talking about treatment, most eating disorders treatment is a kind of all foods fit model,
Yes.
like you're kind of in recovery when you can eat a bit of everything and you're not obsessed with any one kind of food. Unfortunately, we're probably going to go on obviously to talk about intervention and treatment ideas. Obviously, if we've got this model of food addiction, well, what is the treatment for addiction in any other sphere? It's abstinence from the addictive thing. So you can only recover from alcohol addiction or nicotine addiction or drug addiction by abstaining from that addictive substance. Now it's kind of more complicated obviously with food, because we have to eat, but we don't have to eat Ben and Jerry's ice cream. That's not a life-saving. We have to eat good whole foods, yes, because we need foods to live. But on the whole, those aren't the foods that people with food addiction have a problem with. They have a problem with cookies and ice cream, and the researchers have shown that, really. So if we're accepting that food addiction is a real problem, then obviously abstinence has to be part of the treatment, whether you kind of jump 2 feet first into abstinence and try and stick with it, or whether you kind of move from where you are slowly stepwise towards abstinence. Then that's what recovery is, really, is being able to be abstinent from your drug foods, basically.
Yeah, I love that I absolutely think that the model needs to be together because so I was in an eating disorder facility and it was an intensive care. So we were there for 10, 12 hours. We had most of our meals in there. They want you to eat with the other peers that are in there, and they're teaching you that all foods are safe, but most of the food in there was processed. And then if you didn't eat it, you were penalized, and then you had to go drink this like seed oil shake of all the nutrients, and it was so horrible. And I just wonder if they were
Yeah.
to add like a low carb version or a carnivore version in those places where you're getting absolute nutrition and not worrying about eating this cupcake and then having to sit and then write down your feelings, that sugar in that cupcake is absolutely affecting us and emotionally. Yes.
Lighting up the brain, making you crave. And I think there is a thing for people with food addiction that end up in eating disorder services, where
Even.
they feel so out of control when they eat those foods, not just because that's a kind of thought problem where you start thinking, I'm so out of control because I've eaten the cupcake. You literally are out of control because your reward center's gone crazy. Yeah, and we know, you know, there are some kind of famous people in the space, aren't they, that have recovered from severe anorexia and problems like that with a ketogenic or, like you say, carnivore type approach, where they've focused their recovery on, you know, these real whole food approach, and kind of got rid of the foods that make them crazy. So yeah, I think it can be a really helpful thing, but I'm not an expert in eating disorders, so I have to say that.
Hey guys, just a really quick interruption. If you notice, we don't really run ads on this YouTube channel. And just being fully candid, instead of making money on external sponsors, we really wanted to share more about our functional medicine practice so that if you ever need it, you know that what we offer and what we can provide in terms of service and products. If you didn't know, our private practice has one-on-one sessions. We have packages. We do group calls with SIRS and with mind-body or nervous system regulation. And we also do a lot of functional tests. Some people do a complete wellness panel with us. So once a year, they get a detailed, comprehensive blood work to see how their health is doing. We also do functional tests such as stool tests to see if you have parasites or candida or H. pylori. We also do a lot of the Dutch urine as well as saliva tests to make sure that your hormones and thyroid is functioning well. Our flagship is our symptom burden, where we really trust the innate wisdom in our bodies. And so we are trying to see what symptoms do you have, because oftentimes a combination of symptoms is related to a specific system. We focus on gut health, where we try to get people's gut healing, because most of our immune system is in our gut. If you make your own body stronger, you will be a lot more resilient to everything that is in our toxic world. We believe in wellness for all, and not everyone can afford to work with us. So we provide a lot of free guides, free ebooks, free downloads, free tactical things to get you healing in your wellness journey. We also write comprehensive, detailed articles. For example, why a carnivore diet may have lower T3 markers, but may be in fact okay. I hope that the content I share is enough for you to get healing. But if the needle is not moving enough with a carnivore diet, with lifestyle changes, with mind-body work, if it's not moving enough when you are working alone, just know that we have the services to support you when and if that day comes. Because we are holistic health, we also have a prescriber. So if you are on thyroid medications or hormone medications, or you need medications for SIRS, we are able to walk you through the process. Our goal is to get you off most of your medications. All right, guys, thank you for being part of this community. Let's get back into the video. So what are the additives that make certain foods more addictive? If you were to name a few of you probably don't want to eat this food that contains these additives.
So definitely, if you're recognizing kind of these symptoms, I mean, it's always sugar. It's always pure sugars, because they, you know, we know from the work of people like Nicole Avena that that it's just those sugars go straight to the reward center. You get a big hit of kind of dopamine, is particularly the neurotransmitter that's involved in all addictions. Get a big hit of that. But unfortunately, then what happens is, because like everything in biology, it's trying to, your brain's trying to stay in balance. Everything in the body is trying to stay in balance all the time. It gets a big hit of dopamine. The brain responds by downregulating some dopamine receptors. And what that means is that even when dopamine's around, then it's harder for the brain to sort of receive and use that dopamine. And dopamine's this kind of motivation neurotransmitter, the reward neurotransmitter. So we need it, and we need it at, you know, these kind of steady levels. So unfortunately, the more of those very sugary foods that we eat, the less availability of dopamine we have, weirdly, and then we feel a bit more depressed and a bit unmotivated, and we're more likely to go seek that dopamine again by having the sugar or the refined carbohydrates, and we get another boost. But unfortunately, over time, again, that's kind of, it's actually down regulating these dopamine neurotransmitters. So we're craving it, we're having it, but we're actually kind of digging ourselves into a hole of depression because we've not got that reward feeling available to us in a sort of healthy way. So your question was about what to avoid. So definitely sugars, definitely refined carbohydrates, and why? It's because where the refined carbohydrates are starches that are quickly digested, and all starch is glucose molecules holding hands. This is what my husband says when he tries to explain to his friends with diabetes. It's literally little glucose molecules all in a line, and those bonds are quickly broken, and then that's again quickly sugar in the brain. So sugar, refined carbohydrates, which are sugar, and then foods with things like caffeine in, and like you mentioned the seed oils, didn't you? This, people are now wondering about the seed oils and things like, again, it's not something I follow very closely, but that does seem to mess with your natural endocannabinoid sort of system. Yeah, again, it's not my specialist subject, but don't eat them, don't eat the seed oils. And then obviously anything with sort of MSG, which is monosodium glutamate, it's sort of made to make things taste more delicious, and we know that it makes people kind of overeat things. In fact, I get if I accidentally have something with MSG in it, which I have a couple of times, I have a really odd reaction to that. I get a racing heart. I'm kind of awake all night. It's horrible. And basically things that come in packets, in colorful packets with, ingredients that you don't recognize and you wouldn't ever have in your kitchen. So there's lots of hidden sugars in packaged foods, like maltodextrin is one that sort of comes up a lot, isn't it? Maltose, all of these O's that have got sugar in. I'm always checking. I mean, I don't eat much out of packets now, I must say, but partly because you're so shocked when you look at the ingredients and you think, oh, this isn't really food. But yeah, check all the packets, and if it's not got stuff that you've got in your kitchen, or if it's got more than 5 ingredients, you probably want to avoid it, really, if it's highly refined and kind of made in a factory. So we advise, when we do our we do online sort of treatments or in-person in retreats with people, it's all real whole foods as nature intended, with a sort of priority on protein, and yeah, usually animal protein. Obviously we do have people who are vegetarian, but we do say, it is much harder, really, because your brain wants those amino acids, it wants those good fats to kind of heal, because you've kind of damaged your brain, really, by eating these ultra processed foods and the sugary foods. So we do recommend that people eat real whole foods, real plenty of protein, so that you're not hungry. Don't be afraid of animal fats. And then to preference, really, whether people have vegetables and low carbohydrate fruits, things like that. If nuts, if they can tolerate them. Some people have a bit of a problem with nuts. They're quite hard to moderate. Right. And dairy is the other thing that actually some people specifically have a problem with, even though it's a whole natural food. It's kind of designed to be overeaten in a way, isn't it? It's to feed up baby animals, usually calves. It's a growth food, and it so dairy products like cream and cheese tend to be very easy to overeat, or to sort of have that sort of relationship with. So sometimes we have to have that conversation with people about, maybe for you it's worth trying a kind of a trial without the dairy. For some people, that's, it's always the difficult thing to give up, but it is, yes, for some people, can make a real difference.
We've noticed that with our community as well. Some people will go carnivore and then they start overeating dairy, and so when they remove that will help. I hear sometimes it's the casomorphins in it. Some people say that's addictive. Some people say it isn't. But I think people will know their tendencies if they start going back to it's the same stuff, the cage definition. If you start going back to the kitchen and wanting another piece of cheese and stuff. I had a question about the sugars. So in the wellness space, obviously people will say, well, organic maple syrup in its true form or pure form, or like natural honey, but from an addiction model, is it the same level of I just want to ask, are all sugars, because people will say that honey versus high fructose corn syrup is different. And yes, it is totally different in terms of the way in nutrition and things like that. But in terms of addiction,
Yes, is the answer. So things like honey, yeah. I think the thing is we always want to, because sugar is quite addictive, we always want to kind of hang on to it in some form, don't we? Always hoping somehow, the addiction's kind of going, oh well, maybe honey's all right. We always get this question, yeah, or maybe maple syrup, or maybe in terms of the sort of, the reaction of the brain to those foods. Because again, I think it really helps to look at it from a survival point of view. So say in the autumn, there may have been a few little sweet berries. You may have been able to shin up a tree and get some honey if you were feeling really brave, if you were really motivated. And that was a good thing because you'd gorge on those things. Sugar sort of turns off the off switch for satiety, doesn't it? So we can all, it's like everybody always says, oh, there's always room for dessert. And that's because the satiety sort of switch get turned off. So we can carry on eating the sweet things. So we could put on weight to survive the winter. And that was the idea of that switch being turned off. So things like fructose and sugars, we can really overeat, and that was a great thing, and that's why we're here, because our ancestors did that, and thank you to them for being people who would kind of shin up a tree and eat the honey. But that means that sweet taste in any shape or form, for most people who are food addicts, so if you're not a food addict, a little bit will be all right because you'll be able to have a little bit and get on with your day. But if people have those symptoms that we talked about, it's really likely if they have a bit of sugar or something with maple syrup on, it's going to kick off those cravings for more, and they'll start to sort of lose control. And it happens with sweeteners as well. So we really counsel people with this food addiction problem to be very wary of sweeteners as well, because even though they've not got the actual sugar in and the actual calories, there's something about that sweet taste that seems to kick off the dopamine, the cravings, and the sort of wanting more and more of whatever it is. And that's why for people with the food addiction problems, these sort of keto baking, keto treats, keto kind of protein balls with sweeteners in and so on, can be problematic. And most food addicts probably go down that cul-de-sac, when if they go keto, they get drawn into that, oh, it's okay, if we have the sweeteners and do the baking with the almond flour, and you start kind of recreating your favorite, whatever was your favorite cookie, you start doing keto, trying to ketonize it, that's probably going to cause its own problems, really.
Yeah, I could tell from my own personal. So on good days where life is easy, there's no issues, I didn't have any emotional things that happen, and I did the self-care, those days adding keto treats, not an issue. But the days that things were hard, which is, where life gets lifey. And on those days, the keto treats, whether it was a diet soda, some, sugar-free candies, or the keto bakes, those things then it was not enough, that then I would eventually want the real sugar, and then I would go on this crazy binge. And so that's when carnivore works so well for me, because it's complete abstinence of anything sugary. Yes, maybe dairy can hit the reward centers as well, but not as much as all of those sugary foods. And so I'm right there with you. For me, now I can dabble in a little of those as I've been healing, but initially I couldn't have any bit of diet soda or anything sweet, because that sweet would wreck me in terms of then coming back to standard American diet foods.
Yeah, exactly. It's a kind of you need that kind of, there's Susan Peirce Thompson, who's written the book, hasn't she, Bright Line Eating. You need these kind of, like, I think, and like you say, particularly initially, you need these kind of hard rules about, this is definitely off the menu, because the brain has to recover, and it has to heal from all of these kind of repeated pathways that we have in the reward center, that we've sort of we've trodden this path so many times around the like you say, the sugar and the as also as a we've not really talked about it, but also as a coping strategy. So if I'm feeling anxious or depressed, obviously we've learned to use food for the wrong things, haven't we? We haven't learned it's just about nutrition. We've learned as children that because sugar's the only thing that it's the only psychoactive substance that we give children. We don't give them alcohol and nicotine, but we know that, you know, sugar changes your brain state. And as kids, for whatever reason, either because food was given as a reward, or because, you know, maybe we're in a difficult situation and we realized that if we ate certain foods, we kind of felt a little bit better temporarily. Yeah, it takes quite a while to unlearn all of that, and to learn to sort of manage emotions in different ways. And that has to be part of the treatment as well. So it isn't just the food. The food is the first step, in a way, is getting into the abstinence from whatever your drug foods are. And then obviously, to keep going, you know, if you've been using food emotionally, then you need some other tools. You need, you know, some other ways of managing that. And because we've been maybe because of this effect of focusing our lives, you know, on the food, we need to kind of you know, start doing exercise. We start socializing and start sort of spending our time thinking about other things than food, and also getting the dopamine and the serotonin and these neurotransmitters in a different way, in a healthy way, you know. So we know, for example, that exercise is brilliant for dopamine. And you know, even if we hated exercising as children, which I definitely did, we need to find something. You need to find some form of movement that you enjoy, because that's, we would, again, evolutionarily, we're designed to move around and you know, literally go hunt our food for survival. So we need to find some way of moving around that we enjoy and we can incorporate into our lives. Some way of getting support as well. You know, it is like any addiction, this is a lifelong problem. So we can be in recovery, you know, from being abstinent, like you were saying, and, you know, also doing these other things. That doesn't mean that we're completely out of the woods, you know. Like you say, when life gets lifey, you know, we all get drawn back to these things, and we all get put in situations that are very challenging, like, you know, people's birthdays, or going on holiday, or, you know, places where really everywhere you go now is ultra processed foods and sweet foods. And
Yeah, one thing
difficult.
I saw during COVID was, so I was in the carnivore space before COVID, and everyone was a lot more friendlier on the social media. And I'm sure social media has changed since COVID too, but then COVID happened, and there was a subset of people that then declared online that I'm free from these diet rules. I'm going to just live my life. And I really saw, oh, the stress of COVID just hitting, and, you know, all of us didn't know what was going to happen. And then everyone's like, well, I'm just going to live my best life and eat the foods I enjoy. And you see the addictive or the coping strategy with, I'm just going to have solace being stuck at our home. And then
Yes.
so many people turn to food. And that's when I realized this isn't just about, I need to eat what will make me healthier. It's also this, we need to learn coping strategies. And I also went through that when I first went from keto to carnivore. All of a sudden, when I'm feeling these really uncomfortable feelings, and I'm feeling like feeling that maybe my self-care wasn't respected, or that I didn't vocalize my needs. And so when I used to turn to food, I didn't have these foods anymore. So I would have to white knuckle and sit through those emotions. And it is so hard. And so what coping strategies do you then start to implement? Because I think awareness is number one. Many people don't even know that they turn to food for comfort, celebration, for every single type of emotion. And when you remove that from happy hours, from celebrations, from, you know, when you're sad, let's go grab some ice cream. When you go to the dentist, here's a lollipop for having good teeth. So, you know, all of those things. So what tools should people use? And you mentioned exercise. I did a lot of research recently on exercise, and it absolutely supports those pathways to have less addiction. If you start implementing exercise, is actually a protective mechanism. So
Yes.
fully on the same page with you with that. But what are some other coping strategies that you recommend when you realize that you're using food as a support system?
Yeah, it's kind of a little bit individual, but there's definitely some sort of like you say, some sort of bond or evidence-based things. So number one actually is, you know, if you can get into ketosis, um either by doing kind of standard keto or carnivore, that's really going to help, because it, you know, it seems to be that in that state we have better access to our frontal lobes, the sort of logical part of the brain. And there is good evidence that it helps people with other addictions. So we've not got the studies on keto for food addiction. Nobody's actually done that. There's been a couple of case studies, but there's been no sort of big studies. So that's number one. Get the food right. And I would say that's the bottom of the pyramid, really. You know, focus on that first, and that will start, you know, that will help. That will start to help the sort of cravings. Yeah. Number two, as we've said, because there's so much evidence for it, is to find some form of physical activity that you enjoy. I mean, it could just be walking, actually. I do other exercise, but I try and incorporate a walk every day. And that's not about burning calories. None of this exercise business is about burning calories, because then we're going back into the eating disorder space. It's for your mental health. So, you know, get a walk in. But there's also other, you know, it doesn't have to be, you know, people always think of exercises like, you know, marathon running or, you know, lifting enormous weights. Obviously, weightlifting is actually great, you know, developing the muscles. If you find a way to do that and enjoy it, that's great. It doesn't have to be so intense. Things like yoga, which is going to incorporate, you know, movement, but also with that mindfulness and also with that breathing, that can be fantastic and really good for serotonin levels. And, you know, there's all kinds of benefits to some sort of a practice like yoga. Yeah, so that's the physical activity side. And, you know, and also, if people want to maybe start some sort of a mindfulness or meditation practice, there's so many kind of online resources now, aren't there, that people can sort of check into, and, you know, maybe make that commitment, even if it's only 10 minutes a day, to practice something like that. Because again, there's so much evidence of the benefits in terms of our mental well-being. And if we're keeping our mental well-being high, then we're not having to turn to food. The next one would be, well, whatever else, you know, experiences do you have in life where you maybe get into this sense of sort of being in the moment, you know, this sense of flow or being in the moment, if people know what I'm talking about, where you kind of lose track of time and you're so sort of absorbed in something. Usually it's some kind of a hobby like music, piano playing, or I do a lot of knitting. That's something that I've always loved to do, and I find it very absorbing and kind of relaxing. So, you know, have you got something like that? It's just a thing that you really love to do and you really get absorbed in, and can you make time in your week, you know, to do something like that, that gives you that real natural kind of boost feeling. And it could be anything, it could be singing, dancing, I don't know, any kind of hobby that people love. And then I think the other really important part of recovery is connection with other people with the same problem. So and there are more and more sort of resources for people here as well. So we always have follow-up groups from, you know, any treatment that we do, and we encourage people to, you know, to join food addiction community. So it's just the idea of kind of connecting with other people, and, you know, then you've got a community that you can connect to and talk about when you're struggling. You can ask for help, you know, or you can help other people. And this works so well in any form of sort of addictive or sort of chronic problem, really, having that community around you and trying to find that tribe that's going to support you is going to make a difference. And then the other thing I think is really reflecting and using times when you've had a wobble or a struggle, and kind of thinking through, well, what was it about that day or, you know, that circumstance that that led me down this path to sort of having a lapse or a wobble. And sometimes that can be our best lesson, because, you know, like you've obviously done a lot of that work yourself, and I've had to do a lot of that, is, you know, what situations are going to be really difficult for me, or what emotional, you know, what emotions are going to sort of get me in trouble. Because then you can think about, well, what would you do differently
Right.
next time, you know, in an earlier stage, before you were really on the runway. You know, could you phone a friend? Could you sit down and, you know, just take 10 minutes to do some meditation? Or, you know, is there some way of sort of taking a different path before you get drawn in? Because once the cravings and compulsions are really triggered, it is hard to kind of, you know, to stop them dead. But you know, it's having that personal kind of plan of, you know, if this happened, if I'm starting to feel like this, or if I notice, you know, when is it that I feel I'm going to be in trouble? Is there a protocol that I can put in place that's going to sort of stop that happening? So we often have conversations with people like, you know, I know I'm in trouble when
Yes.
you know, what are you going to do instead? And people often say things like, you know, I know I'm in trouble when I'm in the supermarket and I'm walking down the chocolate aisle, or the, you know, the wrong aisle, and doing this kind of zombie shopping, you know. And, well, what would you do, you know, if you find yourself doing that? What are you going to do to get yourself out of that? Or my one is, I know I'm in trouble when I go in the kitchen and I'm just randomly opening cupboards, and actually there's nothing in my cupboards, which is particularly exciting, because I don't keep these foods at home. But, you know, if I'm just kind of looking in cupboards for something to eat, I need to think to myself, right, what, you know, what is it that I need? I'm not hungry, obviously, because I've had my good proteiny meals. You know, maybe I need to go out for a little walk, or phone a friend, or
Yeah, I
sit
think those things are really
down.
helpful where if maybe you create a checklist of all the things that maybe you are triggers. Sometimes I like considering in my eating disorder facility, we learned about yellow and red flags. So those are where you're starting to see, like, maybe the first clue is the opening of the cupboards. Maybe you don't do much that day, but now that's a yellow flag because you typically don't do that. And that may be now you're leading into the red flags. One thing that I love that I use, this isn't intended for it, but so we created this. So when you are not in an emotionally heightened state, or in the state where you're riding the wave of a craving, and you think about what are things that maybe in 15 minutes, 10 minutes of your day that you can use that you find joy in, or that makes you happier. So
Yeah,
maybe it's a small hobby. And then when you're in that state that you are now having a white knuckle, where you don't have to think about, do I do a walk? Do I call? Instead, so you start grabbing every single thing and you keep walking through every single thing until you start feeling better. And
yeah,
for some people, they're not going to fully feel better in that moment. And so maybe then they hyper write down everything they're going through in that process of eating that junk food, of like, so then what is manifesting when you're, opening up the wrapper, tasting it? How do you feel? What does it taste like? Do you feel excitement? And maybe they can figure out what's the trigger. So, and then, because usually afterward we feel like, oh, why did I do that? Right? That
yeah,
feeling of shame, guilt.
yeah,
And usually there's a trigger. There was a
yeah,
fight or a hard day at work or
yeah,
something happened. And I think making it super contextual, I think
yeah.
does so much in terms of wonder. So yeah, I think
Yeah, and not feeling, you know, try not to do that thing where you kind of beat yourself up, but really go at it more
yes.
like, as you say, like, okay, well, let's actually break it down, and what went on there, so that I can do something different next time. So it's always a lesson, it's not about being a failure. It's just that, you know, this stuff is quite hard, and it's really hard to change these habits of a lifetime. Yeah.
I have a controversial question. So
Hmm.
I've I've had people say, and I experienced it a little bit in my life too, where so when I first joined the eating disorder groups, they were so helpful because, like, oh, like, I'm not alone. I'm
Yeah.
not the only one that has these thoughts and these struggles. And I'm not the only crazy one that goes out in the middle of the night and goes on a binge. But at a certain point, as I was healing, I felt like, now that I'm healing so much and there's people that are brand new, and of course I should give back, but sometimes I would leave the group and I'd feel like, oh my gosh, I'm back into being sick. And so it would almost trigger me to feel like I'm still stuck and sick when I felt like I was, before going into the group call, I felt like I was doing pretty good. So how do we balance that, where as we're healing, maybe too much into the focus of food addiction now is priming us to think the world that we're living in, the lens of the world is just food addiction.
Yeah.
And then that becomes hard to almost, then we're stuck in our illness in a sense.
Yeah. Yeah. I get what you mean. Yeah. There could be too much illness talk, if you
Yes.
like. Yeah. So I think the answer to that is that groups need to be run by
Okay.
somebody
That makes
who
sense.
knows what they're doing, and that it's always focused on the recovery, on kind of what's, what have you noticed that's going well, what are you working on at the minute? Yeah,
That
maybe
makes sense.
what was the struggle over, but what would you do differently next time? So it's always that sort of solution focused thinking. And then we don't have to be drawn into problem
Okay.
talk and kind of being stuck in.
Just like a
And
venting. And you're right. The one of the calls, they were like brand new therapists. So it's probably why they there was one specific in-person meeting where I think everyone left kind of defeated. And I think it's also, but you're right. The therapist, I
it's
think
to do
two of
with
them.
the facilitators,
Yes.
or if it's a 12-step program, there is there's a way of running
Okay.
the group so that people don't leave feeling too downhearted. And it can be so amazing, can't it, listening to other people's success stories, and stories of kind of triumphing over these difficult difficult symptoms. Yeah, but yeah, I hear what you're saying. That sometimes groups are run in a problem focused way, and that's not a positive thing for everybody.
Yeah. And I think the other thing is sometimes I notice even in our practice where some people will use, well, I have this illness or I have this addiction or I have this disease. And so therefore there's not much I can do about it. And that's where I feel that no, we should always keep the power. We should always feel empowered that even if we struggle with food addiction, and that's why we dabbled in the sugar, then we still pick ourselves up and we continue forward. I hate it when people are like, well, I'm battling $1 billion food industry, so I can't help that
I'll
and
give
then
up.
when they're
Yeah.
stuck in that, like yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, that there is definitely hope, and recovery's possible. We see it all the time. That doesn't mean that people don't. It isn't hard,
Right.
from time to time. Yeah, it's not plain sailing, is it? Ever any kind of recovery. But it is worth it, and it is worth keep picking yourself back up and yeah, and trying again, and just
Yes.
learning from mistakes.
In your patient community, what have you found that has the most efficacy in terms of healing? Like if I said, okay, Dr. Jen, I'm going to work with you. I want to start healing because I acknowledge that maybe I can't stick to a diet or a certain way of eating or a certain lifestyle because I do think I have a bit of a food addiction. How should I get started?
I think the first thing is probably acknowledging it. So we have some people coming to us and they say, "Oh, I'm not sure this is quite for me, but I've come along anyway." And usually those are the people that absolutely when we go through like the
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
symptoms, that they go, "Oh God, that is me actually." So I think the first is to sort of, if it is you, if that is your problem, accept that that it's your problem, and so now it's your responsibility to do something about it, really. So that would be step one, is kind of coming out of that denial mode. Yeah, oh, I don't think I'm addicted, kind of thing. Number two would definitely be, as I say, to the bottom of the pyramid, is the foundation is to get the food right, so that it's nutrient dense, real whole foods. It doesn't really matter, I don't think. I think it's kind of personal preference whether that's a kind of low carb, keto, carnivore thing, whatever kind of suits people. But you needs to be really adequate protein, because that's the thing that's going to reduce the hunger and the craving. It's not a diet, it's about proper nutrition. So this isn't a weight loss plan, because if people are losing weight, they're going to be hungry, they're going to be craving foods, they're going to, you know, binge or, you know, or kind of fall off the wagon. So, you know, it's a really good amount of proteins and real fats, vegetables and fruits if you want them, not if you don't. So, you know, that's a sort of personal thing, really. So get the food absolutely right. And then the next stage, as we've said, is think about, right, what does life look like beyond the food, and trying to make this life that is supporting your recovery, it's supporting your mental health, and your neurotransmitters are kind of getting balanced. And that's all that stuff we were talking about, you know, exercise, you know, hobbies, meditation, mindfulness, all of that. And then it's just rinse and repeat, really. You know, try and have a daily routine which you kind of stick to, which is, you know, do have your meal plans, you know, have you kind of each day your plan in place, you know, whether you're at home or whether you're going to be traveling or whether you're going to somebody's house, you know, that needs negotiating. You know, you need to, if I'm going on an aeroplane, I have to think, right, I'm going to actually cook some pork belly or whatever it is, because I'm going to put that in a box and I'm going to take it on the airplane. So I've got to, you know, I have to plan the food, but also, you know, when am I scheduling in that movement? When am I scheduling in, you know, that time to do something that brings me joy? You know, we're all incredibly busy, but you have to plan for your recovery. You have to keep yourself well, otherwise it's going to be a real struggle.
Do you find that most of your patients, if they stay committed, are able to overcome their food addiction?
So we've actually did some research on our program with we published the first sort of food addiction intervention outcome paper a couple of years ago, and we've now got the 1-year follow-up data, which are extremely positive. So we looked at the Yale food addiction scale and also the CRAVED scale, which I described. So we had two food addiction scales, and we had a mental well-being scale. We also looked at weight. Even though it's not a weight loss program, lots of people come along hoping to lose weight, obviously, because they, you know, that's the one thing that's distressing them about this overeating, is that they keep putting on weight. And I mean, pre and post program, we had great outcomes, but at 1-year follow-up, people continued to improve. And we had, I'm just writing up the paper now, all significant improvements in the addiction symptoms and improvements in mental well-being, which were sort of maintained over a year. But lots of people changing category on the Yale food addiction scale, because in the Yale food addiction scale, you can have no food addiction, mild, moderate, or severe. And most of the people coming into the program were in the severe category. And at the end, most of the people were in the no food addiction symptoms or mild. So that's hopeful for people, that if you stick to the kind of advice I've been sort of saying, the food, and then the, you know, the stuff beyond the food, like exercise and self-care, if you stick to that consistently, the symptoms of food addiction will disappear.
That is powerful. Thank you so much. If people wanted to work with you, do you only work in the UK or do you work internationally? Your groups are they online? If you could share a little bit about your practice.
Yeah, of course. So at the minute, because we're so busy doing lots of international exciting things about trying to get the condition recognized. So for example, I will just mention that we had a conference this year in London in May, International Food Addiction Consensus Conference. It was incredibly successful. And we're going to have another one next year, and it's going to be in Mexico City in September next year, with all the kind of international experts on food addiction coming together. So if people are interested, do come along. Heidi and I do a residential program in the UK, in the south of the UK, at a place called Coombe Grove. So you can come along and have sort of 3 or 4 nights with us, all the food's provided, and we go through all the information that you need. We haven't got online groups at the minute, but we work very closely with some guys over in North America called Sweet Sobriety, Molly and Chrissy, who are fantastic practitioners, and they have online groups that are suitable for most time zones. I think the people who do our program also do their follow-up with Molly and Chrissy, because they work in a very similar way to us.
Okay.
And they're interesting, both of them, because they're experts in, well, certainly Clarissa can do the work with eating disorders and food addiction as well together. So they're super to work with. There's another concern called SugarX Global, who are over in the States, and they do a lot of work with people with food addiction online. So yeah, there's a number of resources for people. And I've written a little book called Fork in the Road, which is available on Amazon, and all the proceeds go to the charity that I work with that's doing all this work around food addiction. And we've also got a 100-day journal out, so that if you're starting on your journey and you read Fork in the Road, you can then journal for 100 days about your recovery and reflect on what's working, what you need to do differently. You can plan out what you're going to eat, etc., etc.
Okay, well, thank you so much. And do you have any social media accounts where people can follow you?
Yeah, so on X, I'm at Dr. Jen Unwin. So DrJenUnwin, Dr. J Unwin on X is where I mostly hang out on social media. And the website for the charity and the work that I do is www.the and then -chc.org.
Okay, well, thank you. And I'll put all of that in the show notes. And I'd love to grab the study from you that I'll also put that in the show notes if people want to look into
I'll
it,
send you
because
that.
I think it's so powerful to share that people can overcome food
Yeah.
addiction, even if you have to eat food every day. There's a right way to do it. And I think I am a total testament. I never thought I would get over my eating disorder and the struggles. I thought I always had to sort of ignore it, but struggle. And I genuinely don't struggle anymore. And I know that I also had the food addiction because my dad, touched the alcohol, my brother touched the drugs. And so I was like, I am not going to do that, not knowing that I could get addicted to food. So
we didn't talk about genetics, did we?
yeah.
But it is there. My mother was definitely 100% a food addict herself.
Okay.
And it's definitely runs in families. And like you say, sometimes it comes out as alcohol,
Right.
sometimes it's the drugs. Some people have all three, but it's definitely the same part of the brain. Yeah.
Yeah, no,
For sure.
that makes sense. And I also think it's like the lifestyle part of it. So maybe it's because I saw my dad in
Yeah.
moments that he had to cope, he used his external thing. And so then I learned behavior of that. Oh, okay, maybe in a certain hard situation, I have to turn to something as my dad did. Or I'm sure there's
Yeah.
genetics too, but I think there's also like the lifestyle part as well. So it makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, thank you
Sure.
so much for the work you do. Food addiction and my eating disorder nearly killed me. And so it is such a deep and important part of, we don't focus on eating disorders, but we focus on chronic illness. But so many times people have this unhealthy or not ideal relationship with food, and it's not their primary concern because they're chronically ill, but I do think it has a component in their injury or their illness as well. So thank you so much for the work you do. I will put all your information in the show notes.
Okay. Thanks, Judy.
Thank you. Okay, guys, I hope you enjoyed this conversation, and I hope that it gives you some tools and tactics and techniques to use to try to get over any imbalances with food, any pulls that we have with food that we know that it's probably not ideal to eat. Now, I'm a believer in self-empowerment. And so I never want you to use your addiction or disease or diagnosis as a crutch to why you are unwell. Yes, those things are true, and we need to work towards healing from them. But I never want it to be that because I have this, because the food conglomerates are behind this big pull to make me addicted, I cannot help myself. I never want you to take the power away from you. Yes, food addiction is very real and the pull is very real. If you have candida and yeasty things in your body, the pull to go eat those foods are very, very real. The dopamine receptors and wanting to get more hits of dopamine are very real too. But we must always believe that we can get over something, because our belief system is also really powerful in how successful we can be. I love the jar of self-care. I highly recommend using that, because when we are struggling with those moments of where we feel like we are about to break, it is really hard to go, okay, you know what? I think I'm going to call my friend, or I'm going to listen to music, or I'm going to do all the things that will self-care. In those moments, we are fighting every bit of us to not fall into the urge. And so if you have a jar that just has all your self-care tips, you could just pull things out to hopefully ride that wave of your cravings. Remember that this is a process and it takes time for healing, but healing is absolutely possible. I was one of those people that if you watched A Beautiful Mind, I always thought that I would see the people or the triggers that would make me want to crave certain foods. And sometimes I would fall and I would talk to those invisible people, but that it would be the thing that plagued me for the rest of my life. And the better I got at ignoring those people or those voices, that I would be stronger in my eating disorder, but that I would never fully heal from it. I really believe that I am fully healed, but I want to be smarter than just saying that I'm healed. So I always say that I'm healing so that I never fall back, or I rarely ever fall back into my eating disorder tendencies. Healing is fully possible. And I am one of the N=1 that shows that healing is possible. Have the faith, keep going, and I trust that you can heal too. Okay, guys, make sure to eat a lot of meat. Take care of your bodies because it is the only place you have to live. I will talk to you later. Bye, guys.